I often meet people who say that they're finally done with their narcissistic partner, or at times their parent. They've cut contact or considering, even threatening to go no contact. They're angry, and and they do actually list every injustice, every slight, every hurt. And yet, without realizing it, they're still psychologically organized around that person. That person, I would argue, remains the center of their inner world. What am I getting at with this? Sometimes anger feels like freedom, but sometimes anger is the attachment. If you are experiencing frustration and anger, then there's a good chance that the narcissist in your life is still organizing you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. Today, I'm interviewing Dr. Dan Neuharth, author of If You Had Control in Parents and How to Heal from Destructive Narcissistic Parents. Dr. Neuharth has over 30 years' experience in private practice as a licensed marriage and family therapist. Today, I'm talking to him about what has to shift internally for someone to truly heal from destructive narcissistic parenting. Hello, Dr. Dan. Welcome. I'm so glad you're here with us today because I'm really looking forward to talking to you about specifically how one heals from a destructive narcissistic relationship, in particular with a parent. So, welcome to the show, Dr. Dan.
Dr. M, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's such an important topic. And your podcast does great work, I think, for people in terms of awareness and growth.
Oh, great. Well, thank you for that. So, maybe we could start just in a very general way, okay? Because in an article that you wrote that's published on Psychology Today, and you actually have a book on this as well, but it's about how to heal from destructive, or in terms of your book, controlling, right, narcissistic parents. But before we get into the elements that lead to the healing process, maybe you could just give the listeners a general sense of how do you even define destructive or controlling narcissistic parents?
Narcissistic parents, I think that relationship can be among the most destructive that many, many people can face. Now, I know you're an expert on personality disorders, and I'm interested in how you make sense of it. For me, the essence of a personality disorder, like narcissistic personality disorder, is distortions. A distorted sense of oneself is kind of bigger and better than others. A distorted sense of other people is less than and to be maybe taken advantage of. And a distorted sense of how life works, with a sense of entitlement and certain rules that don't apply to a narcissistic person. And so when someone like that is in a position of influence, like a parent, crucial influence, or authority or importance, like in a relationship with a narcissistic person, it can be quite a challenge to be in a relationship with someone like that.
Yeah, let's flesh this out. This is a good place to kick it off. So it could be challenging. I'm just associating to what you said, and please jump in, Dr. Dan, because if they're distorting, like you mentioned distortions, right? So then everything, I guess, has this quality of what? They've accomplished more, or they are going to do more than they actually do, or they're capable of, or maybe there's an expectation that you as the child should be living up to some distorted expectation of theirs, perhaps?
And it could be, I think that's a good point, or it could be you as a child, your job for a narcissistic parent is to live up to something that they maybe won't admit to themselves, but they fell short of.
Mm-hmm.
And you're supposed to live out their unlived dreams.
Mm-hmm.
That's not an uncommon thing as a parent sometimes. But when we're talking, if you have things you wanted to be and you weren't able to for various reasons, and you want your children to have that chance to hopefully follow their dreams, not yours. But with narcissism, it's extreme.
Mm-hmm.
There's a sense that children are there to fulfill the needs of a narcissistic parent.
Mm-hmm.
They're not there to grow, to learn, to play, to be nurtured, and to become the best that they can be. For a narcissist, there's a sort of a neediness to getting, what we call narcissistic supply, that sense of I'm okay, I'm better than other people. And they get that from their children. Their children almost become a source for them in many ways of, I think, that a sense of well-being that's hard for narcissists themselves to come up with internally.
Yeah. Well, you're touching on one of the ways that I define narcissism. There are so many different ways, and there are also different clusters, or we could call presentations of narcissism. But one of them is that there's a lack of what we call self-other differentiation. So they have a hard time, and this is what you're capturing quite nicely, letting the child develop in a way that's best for the child, right? So in other words, the child is not necessarily what we could say a narcissistic extension of themselves, so that to your point, they could get the supplies or live vicariously through the child. I think this is very common. You see it today. This is just an example that comes to my mind is the parent who's on the sidelines, if the kid's playing some kind of sport and they're not there just to cheer on the child. You see a whole different level of it sometimes where they are so intensely involved in the child's success at the game. So, yeah.
Yes. And sometimes they can be involved in a very negative way. In the book you mentioned that I did some research years ago on people, this is before narcissism was as well known as it is today, but this was a research I did 20 years ago on people who grew up in what they described as having controlling parents. But most of those parents actually had a great deal of narcissism. And I would hear stories like this one woman I interviewed. She remembered when she was very young, perhaps 6 or 7, and she was in this sort of gymnastics competition, and she was on the balance beam, and she was going along, and she heard her mother in almost this stage whisper go, "God, she's so awkward." And within a moment, this young girl fell off the beam. And she told me later, she said, I knew how not to fall off a beam, but that completely disoriented me. And there's a way that narcissistic parents crave the spotlight, they crave attention, and they don't really want their children to have it. And so often they'll steal their thunder. This is this young girl's big moment to shine, and she was sabotaged by her mom. And maybe her mom was feeling embarrassment or things that she wasn't even aware of. But like you say, they can get overinvested either positively or negatively, I think, in their children.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I talk about that quite a bit where if the child's succeeding in some way in life, maybe they get into a graduate program, or maybe they even host a really nice, beautiful holiday dinner and everything is going smoothly. But the parent cannot tolerate, first of all, that level of separateness, right? That they're functioning in an independent way. And what does that say about me? But also the feeling, to your point, that the child might be at that specific moment outshining the parent, and that's too devastating. So oftentimes what you see, again, depending on the type of narcissism, they'll go about this differently, but they'll need to knock down, or to your point, to control, which I want to pick up on that in a moment, but they'll need to devalue, criticize. Sometimes it's very subtle with more of the covert narcissism, but they have a way of then just putting the child down, keeping them in their place, so that the parent can always stay elevated in that way. It's too painful because envy is like the kissing cousin in narcissism. It's always there as well. And you could say that there's even some envy watching their child succeed.
Let's take a quick break.
Are you tired of feeling like you're walking on eggshells all the time? Do you feel drained, confused, or like nothing you do is ever good enough? Are you stuck in a cycle of elation, then criticism and confusion? If any of this sounds familiar, you're not alone. And that's exactly why I created Office Hours with Dr. Anthony Mazzella. That's me. Office Hours is a low-cost, small group space where you could bring your questions about narcissistic traits and dynamics and the places where you feel stuck. You'll be met with honest, grounded feedback. I'll hold the group with structure, but there's also space for a real conversation. This is a space designed for anyone looking for clarity, insight, and support. If that sounds like you, just click the link in the show notes to join us. Okay, I hope to see you there.
It's really uncanny how many people who grew up with narcissistic parents will talk about a ruined birthday, a ruined party, a ruined, walking across the stage, graduating from high school in some way that they were, that it was just the attention was stolen from them.
Yeah.
And so much of the work I do with my clients who grew up with narcissistic parents, A big step is trying to understand what seems hard to understand, which is, why would a parent want to sabotage you? Why would a parent want to do things that impeded your development? It doesn't make any logical sense.
Yes.
But there's a way that people with narcissism, I make sense. It's like a tire, like a car tire that has a hole in it, a leak that can never be plugged. And what's leaking out is healthy self-esteem, to keep that tire inflated at a proper level. I mean, let's be honest, many narcissists, I don't know your experience, but mine in working with people with narcissism is many of them were tremendously wounded early in life.
Mm-hmm.
And they carry a lot of shame. They don't have a healthy self-esteem, and they don't know how to get it from within.
Mm-hmm.
So they try and take it from other people, either by dominating them, by humiliating them, by putting them one down, which makes them feel one up.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what can be so painful and injurious if you have a parent like that.
Well, look, let's get into that. This is a nice segue because you mentioned in your practice, right? And I wanted to note to the listeners that in your article, and I'm sure in your book as well, that you identify several elements to the healing process. And a couple of the things that you mentioned, one is letting go of the victim posture. So that's one of them. And recognizing as an adult, when we regress, I quote the word regress, into childhood roles. So maybe we could talk about that a little bit, because we're just, again, to get the audience oriented, we're talking about growing up with a controlling or destructive narcissistic parent, and then how you can then grow up with a sense of being a victim, especially in this day and age, Dr. Dan, because there's so much content online now. So I think people are becoming a little bit more familiar. They may not understand why their parent might become envious or hold them down or devalue them, but they become a little bit more familiar that, hey, perhaps my parent was narcissistic. And then that could lead them, and I think this is what you were getting at, to feel like they've been victimized, that they've had, this really troubled childhood. So maybe we could just talk about that. Well, I'm assuming, actually, maybe I can ask you, that would be a good place to start again, is maybe just a general sense of what does that mean between, like regressing back to the role of being a victim?
I think that in some ways, narcissistic parents train their children to be one down,
Mhm.
because either they'll give mixed messages, like a father will say to his son, stand up for yourself in the world like a man, but don't ever contradict me.
Mhm.
What are you supposed to do with that? Or a narcissistic parent's needs and quirks will always be primary. They will, in such a way that they'll second guess their children's
Yeah.
decisions and choices, which can lead, it's sort of a breeding ground for a lack of confidence and being almost used to that role of being one down.
Mhm.
I mean, nobody's born as a victim. And many of us are victimized in large and small ways in life. And so much of life is to move beyond that. But we have to take account of the damage that is done.
Mhm. Yes, I'm struck by the tension here, because I'm imagining, as I'm listening to you, that someone can feel like, I grew up with this kind of father, right? And in a way, I was held down. But that's slightly different than somebody, I guess, whose whole identity then becomes, without even always being consciously aware, their whole identity is organized around what? Look at how people continue to harm me. Or it's not safe to it's not safe to speak up, because I know, look what my father did to me. Look at the way that I felt when I spoke up with him, or I excelled in any way. I was always put down. And I don't know if you see that also, like if you see that sort of tension, what in terms of like, yeah, but I really did grow up with this kind of parenting, versus it's become part of my identity now. And then the question is, what do we do when it becomes part of your identity? In other words, that you see it everywhere and it's never safe then to speak up, because people are always going to do what? Either put you down, devalue, or even leave you, perhaps, that they could pull the love away from you.
I think that's really important distinction that you make, is when your worldview is one of expecting victimization.
Mhm.
Because a lot of narcissists really see the world as people who are either can be dominated or who are trying to dominate them. And that's the way they view the world. And so growing up with that, you take that on, but you could never dominate your parents. One of the things that I think is really, really important. Well, first of all, I think it's important. You can't heal a wound, a psychological wound or an emotional wound, without being able to see it and see how you were wounded. So I think it is very important for people who grew up with an unhealthy narcissistic parent to spend part of their healing process recognizing, here's how it worked. Here's what was done to me. Here's how I was made to feel less than.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be painful and it can be freeing. But at some point, I think in everyone's healing, or most people's, let me put it that way, from a narcissistic relationship, the attention has to shift away from what the narcissistic person did to you and how it affected you and how it may still be affecting you, how it may be difficult to trust in relationships even when you want to, how it may be difficult to stand up for yourself when you need to. And at some point there becomes this shift where you focus on, who am I? I'm no longer that little child. Yes, I have to have compassion for my wounds, but I can do so much more than I could. And I don't have to hold on to the views of the world that I inherited from my parents. It's not an overnight thing, but I think that's the turning point in one's healing, of letting go of victimization posture.
Yeah, I mean, I could imagine, and I appreciate the way you're talking about this. I use slightly different language when I describe it. I call like taking a dual perspective, meaning initially in the early phases of treatment, we're trying to help patients increase something that's called mentalization, just the capacity to think about the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of their parent, for instance, and to begin to understand why first that they did do this, to your point, and what would be the motive? Why would they do that? And how much was it really about you, and how much was it about them, to fill up that tire that you mentioned earlier? Or some patients use like the analogy of the leaky gas tank. No matter how much gas you put in, it doesn't really ever fill up. The gas tank never gets filled, right? So this dual perspective is, yes, initially at the beginning of treatment, increasing mentalization, having a deeper understanding, noticing when it's happening is critical. And you even say it in your article, which I really appreciated, and necessary, psychologically necessary. But at some point, we don't want to get caught up in just blaming the parents. So then I think that's what you're getting at, Dr. Dan, is the work has to turn to yourself. And then all of what it means and what it would look like. Many people today, I mean, you probably heard of this, they talk about going no contact, like cutting people out of their life. But what does it mean? First of all, if you don't want to do that or you're not in a position to do it, what does it mean to actually have a relationship with somebody after you recognize the things that we just mentioned, right? That maybe your father did hold you back in certain ways for his own needs. So I don't know if you've given that any thought, or in terms of what that would actually look like therapeutically, like what has to happen to help someone really begin to, well, I guess, accept something, but then say, now the focus is on me. And what does that even look like, I guess, psychologically or emotionally?
Yes. I think the mentalization and understanding it, as you put it, is crucial. Another big component, though, in addition to that comes with that, is grieving it, is the emotional repair that comes with grief. To realize, because it's a sobering truth, that the people who brought you into the world or who raised you, who were supposed to nurture you and have your best interests at heart, often didn't.
Yes.
Just the opposite. And grief is painful. There's many ways to grieve. You can't hurry grief, but it is healing. It's a healing process. It allows one to, once they can, as they're understanding how this happened, and as they're realizing how painful it was and how I may have suffered, can move to a point making that shift from the focus on the narcissistic parent to oneself, because that's what the narcissist always wants. They want your focus on them anyway, all the time. And so if you're spending your life thinking, they did this and they did that, and you're still doing the thing that they taught you to do, was focus on them.
Oh, wait, let's go over that again, because that's a critical piece. So what you're saying then is, if you remain resentful, angry, trying to convince them or explain yourself, or something happens in your life, or even explain something that they've done to you, even today, that is not focusing on you. I think that's what I hear that you're saying. It's very subtle, because then that parent or the partner, whomever, is still central in their life. Is that right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they wanted to be central in your life. They wanted to be central in everyone's life. But when you keep them central in your life through all the ways that you said, either resenting them or trying to change them or trying to still please them endlessly, your life isn't about you, it's about them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that shift to having it be about you, which for some people can be maybe a path for that is, as you talked about, no contact for a period.
Yeah.
To get away from this distorted world. I mean, narcissists' image and the facade of a narcissist is crucial. I mean, they're great image builders and they want to be seen a certain way. They want you to see things a certain way and to believe it, even if it's not true. And sometimes it takes either physical space and time to get away from that, to reclaim, or maybe for the first time, claim a more accurate view of who you are and who the world is, or psychic space. You know, maybe you're still in contact with them, but you build some boundaries that you really couldn't as a child.
Yeah. Here, let me pick up on one thing that you said that's really subtle, and I'd love to get your opinion on this, because when I was just listening, I imagined this scenario. So when you said, and we both agreed, right? And I called it the dual perspective, and you're saying like, focus on yourself. But if you're explaining, or you're angry, or you're resentful, you're holding on to this, you're still making them the center of your stability, right? Like this is still part of your identity. I mean, you see this in podcasting, by the way, or on YouTube, that there are many people out there who've been hurt by a narcissist, a parent, or maybe a husband, and they've dedicated so much of their life now to creating a podcast around this. So this injury still sucks up a lot of the oxygen in their mental world, to say the least. But what I was just thinking when you said that is, even if you're trying to explain something to them and you're still in that role, you kind of are focusing on yourself. Now that sounds contradictory, but let me just play it out and I want to get your reaction. I'm imagining it's still focusing on yourself because you're not just explaining it to them to try to please them, but you're keeping that relationship alive. So then again, you never have to experience, like, let's say you're very compliant, like looking to please. You never have to face an aggressive side. You never have to face the aggression, or you never have to face, to your point, you said this already, the separation, because now you're back in this merged experience with them, I would imagine, right? So that is for you. It's for them, right? Because they're always centered. There's always just one person in the room. That's like a common saying. But on the other hand, it's for you as well, because you don't have to look at these other sides. And then you never have to deal with loss and separation. And to your point, mourning, the loss of that unique relationship that you've had with this person your whole life.
I think that's really important. And when people realize that in some ways early on in life, we strike a bargain, kind of an unconscious bargain with a narcissistic person. And it's, by the way, not a very good bargain, but we don't know that.
Mm-hmm.
And the bargain is, okay, I will feed you, do your needs, let you shape me, and you will protect me. Or I will get that shining attention sometimes that makes me feel okay again. And so we've struck a bargain and this isn't bad. This is sometimes how we emotionally survive to get through childhood emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
And then, but later in life, when you want to go your own way, like you said, you're faced with these questions of, who am I without this attachment to my parent that dominated and that I in some way allowed to dominate my life? And I don't say that with any blame.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have to honor what we did to children as children to just survive an unhealthy, upbringing. In many ways, I think children find the best way of coping, even if it causes problems later in life, but they get through. But then later you come to that question of, who would I be without this connection to the parent? Could I stand on myself? Could I own my own, as you put it, my own aggressiveness, my own existential aloneness? Because when you're tethered to a narcissist, even in a negative tether, you're not alone. You may be being tormented, but you're not facing the existential aloneness of human beings.
Yes.
So that's why the bargain, I think, sometimes can persist. You see this also in marriages to a narcissistic person. It's like people will stay when it's not healthy anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Until they get out, if they do.
Mm-hmm. I like to pivot, if it's okay with you, because I was just thinking of sort of a prototypical way that this may present in clinical practice. And again, I love to get your thoughts on this, because I want to hold together a lot of things that we're saying, but do it by way of a clinical example so that people can relate to it a little bit differently. We're going to pause here for now, but this conversation with Dr. Dan is far from over. Next time, we move from theory into the clinical room. I bring in a specific case example where we can actually see regression, the victim posture, and dysregulated feelings of abandonment. We explore how both of us would work with that dynamically, moment by moment, as it unfolds in real time. So if you're enjoying this conversation, stay with us. I'll share the next part of our interview with you next week. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.